What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another Java tutorial video. In this video we're going to be covering chapter 4, which just has to do with a bunch of conceptual stuff based around objects, creating objects, manipulating objects, and just passing data through objects. So I know a lot of people who are watching this video are probably preparing for the first quiz and just kind of reviewing for that. Just know that Chapter 4 doesn't really have a lot of new conceptual stuff in it. It's not like we're not introducing a bunch of new concepts in Chapter 4. It's honestly just building on what we already know from Chapter 3 and just adding a little bit more stuff. It gets a little bit more complex in Chapter 4. So we're not introducing anything brand new, just, going over what we already know and just adding a little bit to it. So in this video, we're going to briefly touch on the chapter 4 concepts, and then the rest of the video we'll probably just be going over lots of examples. So for the quiz, what you really want to do is just look at examples, look at what the code is doing. You want to have a practical understanding of what the code is doing and know how to actually apply that. So when you're taking your quiz, you know how to code by hand. So with that, let's just jump into what we're actually going to be doing in this video. So the first thing that we're going to do in this video is talk about scope. So if you remember from the last video, scope just kind of deals with, where methods are declared in between curly braces and where they actually exist in programs and in classes. So one thing I'll say about scope that I think everyone should know is that keep in mind that variables only exist within the method that they are declared in. So I'll repeat that one more time. Variables are only existent in the method in which they are declared in. Once you exit a certain method, that variable ceases to exist. So that's just kind of a review from chapter 3. So I'm not going to go too much into depth into what scope is. Just know that scope is really important, and you have to know where variables are declared in order to actually use those variables. So there's a couple examples coming up. I'm not going to go through these examples, but I definitely do think that the examples coming up are very beneficial. So I have a slide of about 4 to 5 examples. What I would say is, I'll scroll through the examples. I definitely think everyone should pause on the examples and just read the little boxes on the side that kind of give you a description of what the examples are doing. But I'm not going to spend too much time on scope. So definitely go through and look at the examples that I'm about to show you. But like I said, all I'm going to say about scope is that you need to know that variables only exist within the method that they're declared in. So let's just go ahead and go through these examples. Let me flip through it. So this is the first one. So like I said, you're going to want to look at the code. There's a method up here. Pause the video if you want, look at the code, and then read these little boxes on the side and, just kind of figure out what is going on here. So I'll go ahead and just scroll through all of these and give you a chance to look at them. So this is the second one. There's a third one here. I definitely think all of these are really beneficial, so definitely take the time to look at this. There's one here. And then the final one is here. Definitely just try to get an understanding of what is going on here. It shows you where certain variables are declared and where they exist, and the little annotations on the side kind of give you a better understanding of where the variables actually exist in a class or in a certain method. So definitely take the time to look at that. So once we understand scope, we can just move on. This is the last example here, so if you want to take a look at that, go ahead and pause the video and look at what it's doing. So those are all the examples of scope. So the first thing we're going to talk about as far as chapter 4 new conceptual things go is called overloading. So the word overloading just means that you're using one term to indicate diverse meaning. So in overloading in Java, it's usually referring to methods. So what this means is that you can write multiple methods and they can have the exact same name, and that's totally fine. So in the example down here, we declared our method. We have our access specifier, whether it's static or non-static. We have a return type, in this case it's void, and then we have a name of a method called simple meth here. And then if you look at the method below it, it's the exact same thing. We have another method called simple meth, which stands for simple method. But the difference between these two methods is that they accept different parameters here. So in this one, this one accepts a double, and this one accepts an integer. So overloading just means that you can have methods with the exact same name, and the way you differentiate between them is through the parameters and finding out what that method actually accepts. And we'll see how overloading kind of plays into what we're going to be doing in chapter 4 later on. So this slide is just talking about, if it is ambiguous, kind of confusing, and you don't know, because the methods have the same name, how to differentiate between them. Like I said, the way you differentiate between methods with the same name is through the parameters that they accept. So definitely look at what's inside the parentheses to kind of differentiate between the different kinds of methods. And so this example down here is actually an example that would be illegal in Java because, you have two methods here that have the same name, so they're overloaded methods, but in this case, it would give you an error because the parameters are the same. They both accept double, so there's no way of differentiating between the two methods. So in Java, that would give you an error. So definitely trying to avoid doing something like that whenever you're actually writing your programs. And the main thing with overloading is that you're probably going to be using overloading for constructors. So one thing that's really important to understand for the quiz and, just for chapter 4 in general and, the second half of chapter 3 is you have to understand what constructors are. So constructors are a pretty big thing in Java whenever you're creating new objects. So definitely try to understand constructor methods in preparation for your quiz. So just to give you a brief review of what constructor methods actually are, if you remember back from chapter 3, constructor methods are just methods that are created by Java every time you create a new object. And the purpose of constructor methods is that they serve the purpose of being able to manipulate objects and maybe passing data to objects. So if you want to assign a certain value to a certain instance of a class or a certain object, you can use constructor methods to do that. And one thing that's kind of imperative to note is that constructor methods will always have the same name as the class. So when you're actually writing a constructor method, that's what it's going to look like. The name of the method is always going to be the name of the class. So just to give you, a quick example of what a constructor method looks like, to actually visualize what it looks like in code, let me just go ahead and write a constructor method, just to kind of show you what it looks like. So let's say we have a class called employee, which is our public class employee, and then, after that comes your method. So if we're in the employee class, the name of our method, or rather our constructor method, is going to be called employee. So you would just write the word public and then employee, and then now you have your constructor method. So if you notice, one thing that's different with constructor methods is that all they have is their access specifier. In this case, it's public, and then the name of the method. Typically you have, if you have the main method, you have the word public, you have the word static, you have void. There's a bunch of different things that are included in the main method. For constructor methods, you're not going to have that. It's just going to be the word public and then the name of the method. So that's how constructor methods look like. One thing you'll notice when you're taking the quiz, or if you look at quiz examples online, you can also write constructor methods like this. So you can just write the word employee and then open your method. Both of these ways are perfectly acceptable. The second way here, you don't actually write the word public, but it's just implied that the constructor method is public. So you don't always have to include the word public. So, both ways you write it are perfectly fine. They're both correct. One other thing to note about constructors is that sometimes they can also have things passed through them. So that's how you assign a value to a certain object. You can pass it through the constructor. So let's say you want to assign an employee number to a constructor or something. You can say like int empnum, and then you can pass a certain value through the constructor. So constructors are going to have an access specifier, the name of the constructor, which is always going to be the name of the class, and you can have things in the parentheses here as parameters, or you can to pass certain things through to assign values to objects. So that's just kind of a visualization of what constructors look like. So hopefully that provides some context to you about constructor methods. And so this example here is just an example of overloaded methods. So we have two constructor methods here. We have the first method here and we have the second method here. They both have the same name because they're both constructor methods. In this case, in this example here, they don't actually write the word public. Either way, it's still a constructor method. And the way we differentiate between these two methods is that this one has the word employee, this one has the word employee too. But in this case, we have certain parameters passed to the first method and not the second method. So if you want to, so that's how you differentiate between overloaded constructor methods. And each constructor method will kind of do something different. In this case, both constructor methods are assigning value to empnum. So in this case, you're just assigning empnum to num. So whatever gets passed through here gets assigned to empnum and it's sent up here to empnum. In the second method, you're just assigning empnum a value by 999, and then that sends it to empnum up here. So that's just example of constructor methods and how to differentiate between the two different kinds of constructor methods and what they look like. So one other thing that we're going to talk about in chapter 4 is what is called a this reference. Now, bear with me as I try to explain this because it gets really confusing using the word this over and over again, because some people don't know that I'm talking about like the keyword that exists in Java when I say this. So a this reference is essentially just a reference to an object, like it says here. A lot of people are confused by this references, so hopefully I can clear it up through means of an example. So I'll show you guys an example of what it actually means to reference an object and how you use that. So you're typically going to be using this references whenever you want to refer to a certain variable and reassign that value of a variable to, let's say, an attribute or something in order to pass it through an object. I know that sounds kind of confusing, so hopefully this example that we're about to do kind of clears it up. So let's go ahead and look at an example here. So we have a class here called this. So it's just public class this. And then let's say in this class we have a couple attributes. So let me go ahead and create some attributes here. I'll call it private int a, and I'll set a's value equal to 0. I'll have another attribute, call it b, and I'll initialize that value to 0 as well. And then let's say we have a method here called setData. So setData here is actually going to be setting values to certain objects. So in this case, I'll pass it a, and I'll pass it b. So I'm just passing it certain variables to set. So I'll go ahead and open that, and I'll say a is equal to a, and I'll say b is equal to b. So what that is saying is that anytime someone calls the setData method and they pass certain numbers to the setData method, it's going to pass it through the parameters, and it's going to reassign whatever numbers you put in there to the attributes up here. And in this case, they have the same name. So this variable is local to the setData method, but it has the same name as the attribute up here. And we'll go over why I set them as the same name in a little bit and how to manipulate that. So let's say I create another method here called showData, because I want to set my data, I also want to display it. So I'll go ahead and write a couple of print statements here, and then I'll say the value of a is, and then you can just concatenate it with a, whatever the value of a will be, and then I'll write another one here, and I'll say the value of b is, same thing as the one above, and then just concatenate it with b. So that's all I need in my showData method. So now let's write the main method. And again, one thing to note about methods is that it doesn't matter the order of methods. I know you guys are used to having the main method at the top of your program. It's totally fine to put the main method at the end. So the main method, or the order of the methods in general just don't really matter. So you can put the main method wherever you want. So let's say we want to create an object. So the way you create an object is that first you have the name of the class, and then the name of your object. So in this case, we'll just call our object. You have the keyword new. So we'll write new, and then you have your constructor here. So it's just the name of the class with the two parentheses. That's how you know it's a method. So now we've created our object, and now let's say we want to pass data through the object. So we want to assign a certain number to this object. So we'll say object.setData. So we want to set certain numbers to this object that we created. So let's send it a couple of numbers. In this case, since we're using the setData method, we have to pass it values because the setData method actually accepts certain values. So let's say I want to pass it the number 2 and 3. So I want it to assign A to 2 and assign B to 3. So anytime I send this data to the method up here called setData, it'll actually reassign the attributes up here. But we'll see why that's problematic. And so after we create the setData method, we also want to display the data. So we'll go ahead and say object.showData, which is the other method that we made. And we're just calling it here again. And so that when we actually run the code, it'll actually show us the value of A and B. So let's go ahead and run it. And so in this case, it gives us the value of A as 0 and the value of B as 0, which is obviously not as intended. We want A to be 2, and we want B to be 3. And so the way you solve this is by adding a this reference. And so the reason why it's problematic here is because, you have A up here and you have A over here. So when you set A equal to A, Java's interpreter is kind of confused by this. It doesn't know how to set these variables equal to each other because, they have the same name. So you can solve this problem by using a this reference. If you just use the word this.a or this.b, if you go ahead and do that, what that means is that it's a reference to an object. So it knows what to set the value to. So in this case, when you write the word this, it's a reference to the object down here that we created. And in that case, we called our object object. So it's the same thing as kind of like implying that it's like object.a, It's a replacement, a way to reference a certain object so that Java knows what variable you're talking about. So let's go ahead and run this code. And now you see, the desired output is exactly what we want it to be. So we want the value of A to be 2, and we want the value of B to be 3. So in this case, that this reference kind of solves the problem. But, a lot of people will say, well, why don't you just change the variable name then? Instead of having AB, why don't we just change this to C and change this to D? Well, the problem with that is that, let's say we want to create multiple objects. So let's say we create another object here, and we call it object 2 is equal to new this. So in this case, we have two different objects, but the confusion can still come up in the Java interpreter where it doesn't know which object it's referring to. So you can use the this reference again to reference certain objects. So even if you do change the names of the variables here from AB to CD, then confusion could still come up. So that's why people use this reference. Also, keep in mind that the this reference is totally optional. A lot of times you don't even have to use this reference. It's just kind of a way of providing some sort of clarity to the user. So a lot of people, they like using the this reference because it clarifies, what variable is being assigned to what object. So sometimes the this reference may or may not be necessary, but a lot of times it is actually optional. So if this is totally confusing to you, a lot of times the code can actually run without using a this reference. But sometimes on your quiz, it'll actually specify to use something like that. So, just keep in mind, it's good to know, that this actually exists, and it's good to know this concept. And so here's just another example where, certain values are passed through a constructor method, and you use the this reference here in order to reassign the name of certain variables to attributes. So in this case, let me just kind of color code, what variables belong where. So in here you have StuNum and GPA, and so StuNum and GPA are the same thing as StuNum and GPA here. So everything in yellow kind of matches up, and then when you use this reference here with StuNum and GPA, this is a reference to the attributes up here. So what it's saying is, take the values of StuNum and GPA and assign it, to the attributes here. So that's what that is doing. So just know that you can pass certain information to constructors in order to reassign the value to attributes. So, and that's the way that you do it. And sometimes you need a this reference. So that's just an example of what that is. And I know we talked about, the this reference in this class, but, if you don't even know what this class is doing right now, let's just go through a quick review. I know a lot of people are kind of confused by, passing certain data through constructors. So let me just go ahead and do a quick example here and kind of show you what is going on here and how, something like this could show up on your quiz. And so the way this actually works is that notice how, in the class on the left called student, there actually isn't a main method. So, the way these programs actually function is that you have two different classes, and these two different classes work together. So, when you're taking your quiz, you're going to notice that a lot of the quizzes ask you to write two different classes. So in this case, in order to actually execute the class on the left, we have to have another class. So let's just go ahead and write, let's go ahead and create the class. We'll say public class test student. We'll write the main method. I'm not going to actually write out the main method. I'll just write main up here. You guys know what it stands for. And so let's say that we want to create an object of the student class. So Objects are just things that fall under the student class. So let's say there's a student and his name is John, and John is an object of the student class. So the syntax to actually create an object is the name of the class and then the actual object. So in this case, you're creating an object of the student class. So you write the word student. We'll say John is equal to new student again, which is the name of the constructor, and then we close it. So that's how you create an object. So now we've created an object called John, and then we've assigned it as an object of the student class. So let's say we want to pass John certain information. So if you guys didn't know what's going on in the code on the left, like I told you, we're passing it a student number and GPA to any object that we create. So in this example, we created an object called John. So if we actually want to go about setting a certain student number and GPA to John, we can just go ahead and do that in the parameter of the constructor here. So like we have a constructor here on the left, and it's called student. You can pass information to the student parameter, and so here, let's say the student number of John is 1, 2, 3, 4, and John's a smart guy, so let's give him a GPA of 3.99. So that's John's GPA, and that's his student number. So anytime you create this new object, it actually passes that back to the method over here called student. And so when you actually assign these numbers of like the student number and the GPA, kind of the way this program works is that it takes these numbers and it sends it back to the constructor here, because you referenced the constructor and you passed it a student number and GPA, and it takes that student number and GPA, which are here and here, and it reassigns it to the attributes. So these are the attributes here, so that's what it's a reference to. So it takes 1, 2, 3, 4 and 3.99, the GPA and the student number, and it reassigns it to the attributes that are here. And then whenever you actually call the show student method, it'll print out the student number and GPA because it gets it from the class over here. So that's just a breakdown of kind of what the code is doing. So let's say you actually want to display someone's student number and GPA. All you'd have to do is just call rather you'd say John dot show student, because that's the method that actually displays it. So whenever you call the method here, it calls this method and it displays the student number and the GPA, which is the information that you got from here. So for the quiz, you have to know this. So this is just a brief example that I saw, and I thought it would be good to review. So just know that when you create constructors, there's ways to set certain information to the constructors. You can set information here through giving it a value in the constructor, and then if it accepts it here, it passes it here. And then it sets the value equal to the attribute up here, and then after you set the value equal to the attribute, then you can send it to a display method, and the display method is called here, and it actually displays the information. So if you want, maybe pause this, try to understand this, but this is the core of kind of what the quiz is going to look like. So honestly, mainly for the quiz, it's going to be a lot of Chapter 3 conceptual stuff, because Chapter 1 is just about Java, so don't even worry about Chapter 1 for the quiz. Maybe worry about it for the exam. But Chapter 2 is just really basic foundational stuff about using input dialog and dialog boxes and creating variables and parsing. So that's just really baseline foundational level stuff. And then after that, in Chapter 3, that's when you get down and dirty into coding and what Java can actually do with creating new methods and passing data through the methods and creating new objects and passing data through the objects and manipulating certain objects and methods. So that is what you need to know, going forward. So definitely, focus mainly on Chapter 3 and constructor methods and passing data through constructor methods. And once you start doing the quizzes, you'll understand what I'm talking about. So that was just a quick review. I thought, as I was going through the slides, it would be kind of a good idea to go over stuff like this, because a lot of people just don't even understand this. So definitely make sure you understand what is going on here. And so now the last conceptual thing we're going to talk about in Chapter 4 is again, the this reference, but a different way you can use the this reference. So what we talked about earlier is that you can use the this reference to reference objects whenever you're trying to manipulate variables. So it would be the word this dot, whatever the variable is. So this dot variable equals blah, 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 blah. So that is how you set up a this reference for a variable. But you can also use a this reference to reference certain constructor methods. So And so the syntax for using the this reference to reference constructor methods is the syntax here. So instead of doing this dot a variable, it would just be this and then a parentheses, and you would put stuff in the parentheses and then close the parentheses. So just know that you can use this references for a variable or for a method. So let's look at an example of what it looks like to use a this reference for a method. So in this example here, we have two classes. We have a class called student. There's one on the left, one on the right. They're both the exact same class, but they're just written differently. So in this case, on the one on the left, there's a bunch of different constructors here. They're all doing different things, and they're all overloaded constructor. They all have the same name, but the way you differentiate between these constructor methods is by the parameters that's being passed to them. So now if you look at the class on the right, it's the exact same code, but it's a little bit different. This one uses this references to reference a certain constructor. So like we said, we have all these constructors here, but now, you have a this reference written inside some of these constructors here. And what that is doing is that is just referencing the constructor up here. So anytime you call one of these constructors, it sends the information that's being passed to it. So in this case, it accepts an average and an average. It's given a number here, or in the one right after it accepts a number, and then it's given an average here. Whatever the case may be, it sends that information back to, like, I guess you'd call it the parent constructors. And so it sends, these three it references this parent constructor up here, so it sends the information back up there. You may or may not see this on this quiz. I don't think it's that likely that you'll see it on the quiz, but if you do, what it would look like on your quiz is that it would say something like, this constructor calls another constructor. So the way you call another constructor inside of a constructor is you use this reference by using it to reference another method. So that's what it would look like if your quiz or something said that you wanted to call another constructor if you're already inside one constructor. So you can reference certain methods even inside constructors, and this is just kind of the way you're going to do it. If this is confusing, maybe pause the video and just look at what's going on with the code here. The code on the left and the code on the right are both the same program. They both accomplish the same task, but they're just different ways you can write it. I'm not going to go too much into it because chances are you might not see it, but if you do, it's always good to know. And so that's the last big conceptual thing we're going to talk about for chapter 4. So for the rest of this video, I'm just going to be doing example after example to kind of just give you guys an idea of what the quiz will maybe look like. So hopefully that kind of helps. I know a lot of people learn through examples, so I think this is the best way. The first thing we'll do is we'll look at a coding example. We'll code it. I'll actually write out the entire code of what it looks like, and then after that we'll just deconstruct certain code and just pick apart and dissect what certain code is doing. So hopefully that's helpful for you guys. So this is the first program we're going to look at. And so for this program, I kind of laid out the instructions up here in this comment. This is actually kind of similar to the way you're going to see instructions on your quiz. I kind of wanted to kind of emulate what the quiz would look like in order to kind of give you guys a better understanding of, how to translate these instructions into code. I know that's people's biggest problem. And, that's what the quiz is, overall. It's just, you're just taking instructions and you're translating it into code. So, these instructions here are kind of what, your quiz instructions will look like. So let's just go ahead and, let's read this. Let's see what this program is doing. So the first thing it says here is that this program displays the user's account number and balance. So we're creating some kind of program that it's like a banking program or something, and it's gonna show a user what their account number is and what their balance is. And then it says there are two classes in this program. The first class has 3 attributes and 2 methods. 3 attributes will hold the account number, balance, and minimum balance. The minimum balance is shared amongst all instances of the class. The first method is a constructor that accepts a certain number in balance and sets those values equal to the attributes, and the second method displays the info to the user. So let's just go ahead and get started. So it says the first class here has 3 attributes and 2 methods. So I already created the class. I called it public class checking account. So we'll go ahead and open that class, and it tells us that we have 3 attributes. So attributes are declared outside of methods. So before we write our methods, we'll go ahead and write our attributes. So it says the 3 attributes will hold the account number, balance, and minimum balance. So let's go ahead and write the first one. So we'll write private int it said it holds an account number, so we'll just go ahead and call it account number. And we don't have a value for account number yet, so we'll just leave it at that. We'll just declare it and not assign it a value. The second thing that it says is that it holds a balance. So we'll say private. In this case, I'm not going to use an integer. I'll go ahead and use a double, because I know that, a banking account, it deals with decimal points because you have cents and dollars. So, doubles hold decimals. So I'll use a double in this case, and I'll just go ahead and call this variable balance. And then the third attribute is a minimum balance. But notice that this one is a little bit different. In the instructions, it tells me that the minimum balance is shared amongst all instances of the class. So here in the instructions, it tells me it's shared amongst all instances. And so what that means is that for any account that's in this bank, they all share the same value of a minimum balance. So let me just go ahead and create this attribute here. So I'll call it private. In this case, it's going to be static. I'll explain why in a bit. Double, and then I'll go ahead and I'll make up a minimum balance. So I'll say you have to have a minimum balance of $200 in order to maintain your checking account or something, right? So the reason why I put the word static here is because the word static implies that it's shared amongst all instances of the class. It means that anytime I create a new object, the minimum balance is always going to be the same. Oops, I never actually assigned a name to it, so I can go ahead and write minimum balance. But yeah, just to get back to it, so what that means is that anytime someone opens up a new account, the value of minimum balance is always going to be the same. So, you can open up a bank account, I can open up a bank account, and our minimum balance will always be a value of 200. Whereas the attributes up here, account number and balance, are non-static because they're not shared amongst all instances of the class. So anytime I create a banking account or you create a banking account, our account numbers are going to be different, and our balance values are going to be completely different. So if it's static, it's shared amongst all instances of the class. So you can have static attributes. In this case, this would be an example of a static attribute. On your quiz or something, if it did specify that it's shared amongst all instances of the class, then you would know to make it static. And you can just kind of think about it logically, like me and you are not going to have the same account number, and we're not going to have the same balance in our bank. So that's why I know to make that non-static, and I know to make the minimum balance static. So that's kind of a differentiation there. So we've created our three attributes, so we'll go ahead and move on to the methods. In this case, it says the first method is a constructor that accepts the account number and balance and sets those values equal to the attributes. So we just talked about constructors, and we know that all constructors are public, so I'll go ahead and write the word public here, and we know that constructors are always going to have the same name as the class, so we'll go ahead and say checking account, so public checking account. We'll open our parentheses, and it says that this constructor accepts the account number and balance. So it's going to accept certain things in its arguments. So I'll say int, because I know it's going to accept some kind of number. So I'll just go ahead and say int number. And then the second thing it accepts is a certain balance, like a balance amount. So I'll go ahead and say, double amount. And so I know that I have the parameters done, and so the second thing it tells me about this method is that it sets those values that I just set in here in the parameters equal to the attributes. So I'll go ahead and open my method, my constructor method here, and a lot of times when you're setting values to constructor methods, you're always going to be reassigning that value to an attribute, because the variables you declare up here are always going to be local to this method that kind of has to deal with scope. So anytime you want to access that number or that balance outside of the constructor method, you have to actually set it to the attribute. So that's what we're doing here, and that's what it kind of tells me to do. It tells me to set these values equal to the attribute. So someone in a different class is going to give me the number and amount, and then it's my job to set that equal to the attribute. So the way you do that is you just take the attribute up here called account number, and like I said, we're just declaring it up here. We're never actually assigning it a value. And so in this line here is when we're actually assigning a value to account number. So we'll just say account number is going to be equal to number. We'll put a semicolon at the end. So what that's saying is that account number up here is going to be equal to number over here. So whenever someone passes a number to checking account, it's going to accept that number, put it in the variable called number here, and then it's going to, on the right side of the equal sign, and then it's going to set that number equal to the attribute on the left side of the equal sign here, and then that'll go back to the attribute up here and reassign it and give it a value. And so we're going to do that for both of the variables here. So we're going to do that for balance as well. So balance is our attribute, and we want to set that equal to amount. And so it looks like we're done with this constructor method. It doesn't give us any more instructions. And then it says the second method just kind of displays the information to the user. So all we're doing is creating a display method here. So I'll say public void. I'll just go ahead and call it display. Open this method. And the reason why I know this method isn't going to be static is because anytime someone opens up a new account, I'm displaying information that's going to be different every time. So this method is not going to be shared amongst all instances of the class because the account number and balance is going to be different for every account that you open. So that's kind of how I know it's not going to be a static method. So it's pretty simple. It's just a display method. So we're just going to do a print statement here. We'll say account number is whatever the account number is. And keep in mind, you have to, when you're concatenating here and you're referencing the variables, you have to reference the attribute and not the variable. So I can't write just number here instead of account number because it's not going to read it, because number only exists in this method, in this constructor method. It's only local to that constructor method. So you have to write account number here. So that's what we're going to do. We'll write account number. And we'll say, and we want to display the balance as well. So we'll say, and the balance is whatever the balance is. And then we'll also just, I guess we'll mention the minimum balance to them. We'll say the minimum balance is whatever the minimum balance is. In this case, we called it min balance. And so that's the end of our display method here, throw a semicolon on it. So it looks like we're done with the class here. I guess we'll just close out the parentheses. So we followed the instructions. We're done with this class. So let's go ahead and go to the other class. So I've already gone ahead and created the other class. I called it test account. And should read the instructions up here. It says the second class has one method. This method creates two instances of accounts and passes them values. It then calls the display method from the first class for both of these objects. So we're going to create a couple of objects. We're going to pass those objects some values, and then we're going to display that to the user. And notice how, in this method here, we didn't actually have a main method. In any program you're creating, you're always going to have a main method, because the main method is actually, the executable lines of code. The program is not going to read anything but the main method. So you actually have to have a main method and call all the other methods into the main method. So, this one didn't have a main method. So right off the bat, I know that when it says, it has one method, I know the method here is going to be the main method. So we'll go ahead and write the main method here. And then we'll do the work in the main method. So it says this method creates two instances of accounts and passes them values. So you're just creating objects here. You're just creating instances of a class. So I'm creating instances of the checking account class that I made previously. So we'll call it checking account here. And then the name of our account, I'll just say first account. We'll say first account is equal to new, and then the name of our constructor. And then it also tells me that we're going to be passing values to this object that we're creating. And then another reason how I know that we're passing values to it is because the constructor method here, called checking account, actually accepts certain values. It accepts an integer and a double for the account number and the balance. So we'll say that we're passing in an integer first. The account number, we'll say 123, and then the balance is some balance. So we'll just say $400. So that's the balance of the first account. And it says we're creating another account. It's creating two instances. So I'll call this one second account. Set equal to new. Same thing that we did up there. Call it checking account. And then I'm passing it values again. All the name of this one. The account number is 69. And then the value is, I don't know, this guy's richer, so we'll give him more money. We'll say $5,000. He has $5,000 in his bank account. And then it tells me that the method then calls the display method from the first class for both the objects. So now that we've passed the values to the checking account, we actually want to display it. And the way you display it is by referencing the display in the other class. We actually created a method to display the stuff. So the way you reference that is by just doing it for each account. So we say first account dot display, and that's literally it. You're just calling the method from the first class and displaying it specifically for the first account, and you can also do that for the second account. So we're going to do second account dot display, and so now it kind of seems like we're done. So let's go ahead and run it and see if we get the desired output here. So when we run this, it looks good. It says, the account number is, I guess we forgot a space here, but whatever. It says the account number is 123 and the balance is 400. Same thing that we had up here for first account. Minimum balance is 200. And the second time it runs, it says the account number is 69, same thing as up here, and the balance is 5,000. And so, it seems like it's running. So if you kind of understand the conceptual part of this, what it's doing is that, you're assigning it a value here in the class called test account. You're sending the value of 123 and 400 to the other class because it accepts it in the parameters here. Then it sets that value equal to the attributes, and the attributes are sent to the display method down here, and it actually displays those attributes. So definitely try to understand what's going on here, like where the data is being passed and how it's being passed and how it's being passed to certain objects. So this is kind of a simple example, but at its core, this is kind of what the quiz is going to be over. So definitely make sure you understand, different examples like, this checking account example that we just did. And so now that we've kind of hard-coded one example of, what chapter 4 and chapter 3 look like, let's go ahead and look at another example here. So in this example, I'm not actually going to hard code all this out, but I'll try to explain, what this is doing. It's really similar to what we just did. So look at the class on the left. We have a class called box. And in this class, I'll just tell you what this program is doing. It's creating either a line, a rectangle, or a box. And all three of those have different dimensions. So a line only accepts one dimension, a rectangle accepts 2 dimensions, whereas a box, which is 3D, accepts 3 dimensions. So this is an example of overloading methods. So, we have 3 constructors here, and they both do different things, and we know they do different things, and we can differentiate them by the parameters. They all accept different amounts of data and different types of data. So up here, the first thing we do is we declare our attributes. We have a length, width, and height. The first thing that we're doing in this constructor is that we want to create a line, and a line doesn't have a width or a height, so we set those values equal to 0, and we're passing it a certain value of a. So whatever is being sent to the line constructor is going to be sent to it from the class on the right. So if you look at the class on the right called test box, this first line, we call it box, then we're creating an object called it line, and we're sending it the value of 2. And so that value of 2 is sent as the length back to the constructor because it accepts it, and it turns into the variable called a. And you take a and you reassign it to the attribute called length. And in this case, the length is 2. And so now, the line has a length of 2. So whenever, let's say we had a display method or something, it would display that, the line has been created. So, or actually we do have a display thing down here. We have a system.out.print line created. So anytime you actually call this method here, the constructor method, it'll actually display that the line was created. And, it does the exact same thing for every other constructor after that. So in this case, we want to create a rectangle for the second constructor, and a rectangle accepts 2 dimensions, so it's going to accept a length and a width, but not a height, so we set the height equal to 0, and the length and width are set equal to a and b here, which are just going to be accepted from the test box class. So in the test box class, we create an object, call it rectangle. We pass it the value of 12 and 5, and then that value of 12 and 5 gets sent to the constructor method here in the box class. And it does the exact same thing as the constructor before it. And then the third constructor here is for a box, and it accepts 3 different dimensions. And then the length is equal to a, width is equal to b, and height is equal to c. And the way you get a, b, c is from the values here from test box of 12, 3, and 41. And so those values are sent to the class on the left. So I know I went through that really quickly. That might be kind of confusing. So maybe just pause the video here and just look at what's going on and what data is being passed between these two different classes. Once you understand this, it becomes really kind of simple to maybe do the quizzes and just understand what objects are actually doing. So if you want, go ahead and pause the video. But just to continue, we can just go ahead and run this. So we have the main method here, and this is the code that's actually going to execute. So let's say we actually run this. We see that it happened correctly because it says a line was created, rectangle was created, and box was created, because that's the system.out.print statement that we had here for these three things that we were creating: a line, a rectangle, and a box. So that's just an example of data being passed from one class to another class through the use of constructors. And so constructors are used to assign certain values to certain objects. So I'll say that again. Constructors are used to assign values to objects. And so that's an example of how you can use constructors and how you can create new objects and pass certain values to those objects through the use of the constructors here. So that's just another example you guys can look at. And now we'll just look at one final example. I know you've been looking at a lot of examples, but I think these examples, are hopefully helpful to you guys. So this final example will just kind of dissect what's going on here. So it's really similar to the two examples we just did. We have two different classes. We have a class up here called baseball player, and then our second class down here is called test player. So we have two different classes, really similar to what we've been doing. We're creating two different classes and just passing information through the two different classes. So if you look at the first class here, we see that we have some attributes declared. So we have an attribute called count, we have an attribute called number, and batting average. So what this entire program is really doing is that it's just kind of showing, stats for certain baseball players, and it's just displaying those stats. So in this case, really similar to what we've been doing. We have the first attribute here called count, which is a static attribute, because count is just counting the total number of players, and that's going to be shared amongst all instances of the class, because the total number of players is like a total. Anytime you're dealing with like a total number of something, it's usually going to be static because it's like a total count of all the objects or something like that. Whereas the number and the batting average is going to be different for every single player, so those attributes are non-static. So we get into the first method here. So this is our first method, the constructor method, and we see that the constructor method is accepting two different parameters here. It's accepting an ID and an average, which are coming from the values down here. So if we assign it a certain value of an ID or an average, we're getting them from here, from the values we're actually passing to it. And then it takes those values, sends it back up here, and then it reassigns it to number. So like we said, number is the attribute up here. And so ID becomes part of the attribute. So if we pass it the ID of 12 down here, then 12 becomes reassigned to our attribute called number, and then you can actually display it with the second method here called the show player method. So anytime you call the show player method, it allows you to actually display a certain number or batting average for a baseball player. And like we just talked about number and ID, it does the exact same thing in the second line of code here for the average. It just takes whatever average, in this case it takes 0.218, their batting average, and then reassigns it to the variable called, or rather the attribute called batting average, and then that allows you to display it in the second method down there called show player. So that's what the second method here is doing, is just kind of displaying something. And then count here is just a way of like incrementing every single object that you create. So anytime you create a new object, it'll add 1 to count here. That's what this line of code is doing here, just +1. Anytime you create a new object, and it'll count how many baseball players there actually is, and that's static because it's a total number of baseball players. I know that was a really quick run through, so if you want, I guess you can pause this video like I've been saying in the past, just kind of look at what's going on here. But same kind of deal. If we jump down to the second class here called test player, it's just a bunch of lines of code that are creating objects. So right here, you have an object called a catcher or a shortstop. You could have an object called pitcher. In this case, we have an object called outfielder. So these are just different positions that these baseball players are playing. They're just different objects that we're creating, and each of them has a certain value. This one has a number of 31 and a batting average of .385. He has a number of 44 and a batting average of .505. So we're just creating new objects, passing them values, and then we're calling the show player method here, which is kind of just like a display method for every single specific object that we're creating. So if that's confusing, I went through it too fast, just pause the video and just try to understand what this code is doing. And so, we went over, 3 different examples of kind of what you can expect to kind of see on your quiz, but definitely in a more complex, complicated form. So hopefully those examples kind of prepare you. The last thing I'll talk about here is just kind of like as a closing at the end of this video is just kind of tips, or I guess tricks, or how to approach the quiz. One thing that I tell everyone is that you need to practice for this quiz. You have to take a bunch of these practice quizzes. What I tell everyone is to take at least anywhere from 7 to 10 of these quizzes that are online just to prepare you. So it's one thing to just understand the concepts of the different chapters and what everything is actually doing, and just looking at code, but it's a completely different area when you're trying to actually write the code, and especially when you're coding it by hand. Your text editors really help you a lot. When you're writing this code, they kind of tell you where your errors are and stuff like that. But when you're coding by hand, which is what you have to do for the quiz, it's not like that at all. So definitely just do a bunch of these practice quizzes. I'll also say that when you're approaching the quiz, you're going to want to kind of read the instructions first. Read the entire quiz through first. Look at the final output. So there's 3 steps to solving these quizzes. The first thing is that you have your instructions. The second thing is the code, and the final thing is the output. What you're missing on the quiz is the second step, is the actual code. So they give you the instructions, and the instructions on the quizzes are actually pretty specific. So they give you the instructions, you're missing the code, but they also give you the final output. So it's your job to fill in that second step of actually writing the code. So how do you get from the instructions to the final output that they actually give you on the quiz? So definitely, read through the code first. You're going to want to read through all of it, make sure you understand what the program is doing, and then think of it in real life terms and how you're actually going to approach writing this program. Don't just if it tells you to, class 1 does this, this, and this, then class 2 does this, this, and this. Don't just start from the top and just start coding. You should look through the entire program and see where it logically makes sense to start, because you don't want to start with a display method if you don't know what you're actually displaying, or you don't want to start with a main method and you don't want to create all these objects and pass certain information to constructors if you haven't even created the constructors yet. So a lot of times the main method is probably the last method you're going to be writing. So that's just my advice, is just read through the instructions first and just kind of understand where to start logically. Where does this program start? If it starts with asking the user a question, maybe you should start there, or declaring those attributes and then going to asking the user a question, and then from there maybe you have to manipulate that information. So just follow the logical steps of what the program is doing. A lot of times the programs are laid out in really real life terms. Sometimes you might be working with a library, or creating a program for an ice cream shop or something. So it's real life applicable programs. So kind of just put yourself in that mindset. One other thing that I'll say is definitely make little notes on the quiz instructions as you're reading them the first time through. So there's a lot of information you can get, and just little things, little notes you can write to yourself whenever you're taking these quizzes. Let's say you look at the final output, and the final output it has a couple of dialog boxes. Then you can just star the side and just say don't forget the import statement, just so that you have to have that anytime you see dialog boxes. Or let's say the quiz says something it says this number will never exceed 128. Then that's a byte, so you can go ahead and make a little note on the side and say make sure you declare this variable as a byte. Or it says, the quiz says it's passing certain information to a method, then that you're going to have to include it in the parameters. So you'll say that this method has such and such parameters. So there's definitely a lot of information you can just learn from reading the instructions, and you can make certain notes about it. So definitely do that when you're taking these quizzes. So that's all I have to say about the quizzes. Definitely come out to the workshops and stuff. MISSO does a lot of workshops, so just to practice the quizzes, come out to those workshops. So, good luck on your quiz, guys. Hopefully, you guys understand this stuff. Really try to understand it from a conceptual point of view. If it's a couple of days before the quiz and you don't grasp the concepts and stuff, I would just say, just start taking these quizzes, because the best way to learn is to just do it. Just keep applying yourself and keep, and try to learn through application, because at that point, if you haven't grasped the concepts 3 days before the quiz, you have to start practicing the quiz. So just practice, 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 guys, and then hopefully you guys will do well. I think I've set you guys up to understand the concepts pretty well, so now it's just on you guys to just practice it and just apply those concepts that you've learned into actual code and writing these programs. So that's all I have to say about the quiz. Hopefully you guys do well. I wish you guys the best of luck. So that's going to do it for this video. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next one.